This is Spotlight from All Things Photonics, featuring intimate sit-down conversations with preeminent figures in our industry. Unscripted, timely, and topical, this series shines the spotlight on industry-leading changemakers from all corners of the photonics landscape, from the gateways of progress to the most impactful challenges of our time.
Today's episode is brought to you by Hamamatsu Corporation, a leading manufacturer of devices for the generation and measurement of infrared, visible, UV light, and X-rays. Hamamatsu is dedicated to the advancement of photonics through extensive research and offers specialized systems for select applications. Visit hamamatsu.com to learn more.
Late in the summer of 2020, the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, a group of bipartisan lawmakers in Washington formed the Optics and Photonics Caucus. The global crisis had disrupted supply chains and exposed America's reliance on China and Eastern nations for light-based technologies like semiconductors, forcing officials to act. These legislators hope to use this newly formed group to spur photonics advancements through both private and public investments. But while government initiatives can offer aid to tech industries, they can also take it away just as easily. And though long since out of the pandemic, today's global market is volatile and unpredictable. Following the change of administration in Washington, I reached out to lawmakers at the center of the Optics and Photonics Caucus to learn more about the policies and practices that are impacting our industry. Congressman Joe Morelle is a Democrat who represents New York's 25th District, which includes Rochester, and he serves as a co-chair of the caucus. He agreed to answer our questions on policy changes and the direction our industry is heading. Congressman Morelle, thank you so much for giving us the time. We really appreciate you scheduling that with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks. You're giving me a break from the humdrum of Washington. So anytime I get to be distracted, I'm happy for that.
Yeah, well, we're happy to provide it in this way. Well, I wanted to talk because the photonics community right now has got a lot of questions about what's going on policy-wise and what it could mean for their future. And the area you represent, very much involved in photonics, in the photonics industry. We love Rochester. What has the growth in this industry meant to you and the people you represent?
Well, look, it's first and foremost, a huge employer in the region. I think folks know that in Rochester, there's probably about 150 optics and photonics companies, 7,500 jobs. I mean, that's a significant impact on the local economy. And we do a lot of work with those employers and with the employer groups, also with the University of Rochester, with Rochester Institute of Technology. We have really sort of staked our future in many ways on the future of optics and photonics. And Rochester is not unlike many communities in the Northeast that, was a big manufacturing site. We, are also pretty high-end manufacturing at our height. And I tell people it's hard to imagine, and it's now 40 years, so, it's a long time, but it's a generation or more. But there were about 68,000 people in Monroe County, which for your listeners and viewers, Monroe County's 750,000 people, roughly 750,000. The metro area is about 1 million. So, and that hasn't really changed appreciably over the years. It's kind of like a stable population. But 40 years ago, when I was a young man, about 68,000 people just in Monroe County worked for Eastman Kodak Company. Eastman Kodak was so big and so important to Rochester that they had their own fire department. They had their own utility, which wasn't connected to the grid. They had their own baseball leagues, recreation leagues, bowling leagues, theater. It was a city within a city, and almost every family was touched by it. So much so that even on Kodak bonus days, all the appliance stores, the car dealers gave great deals because they knew people were getting their bonus checks 40 years ago. And who didn't work at Kodak worked at Xerox, worked at Bausch & Lomb. The great thing about it, though, is because it wasn't sort of as many communities associated with the Rust Belt and in industries that were sort of, Rust Belt industries, ours was a little more high-tech manufacturing. So we had, certainly if you're at Kodak, chemistry and film processing and what you can do with film, which is so important now in electric batteries. Xerox had xerography and all the things that flowed from that. Of course, Bausch and Lomb, much of the optics, but all of them had a lot of technicians, a lot of people who invested in education, and we had the emergence of RIT and U of R. But those companies, which are all growing again, thankfully, and I'm really grateful to the leadership in all three of them, but they are much smaller than they were. And so you think about what is it that you transition if you're going to be a community that's going to be successful, where do you look for your strengths? And the emergence of optics and photonics was a natural outgrowth of those three companies in various ways. But that it has really supercharged the Rochester economy. So sorry for the long answer, but that's kind of how I view the next. It may not be someone as large as Kodak. I'm not sure we're going to have a company in Rochester ever that employs nearly 70,000 people, but these are growing. And one of the only challenges for the continued growth in Rochester of the sector is really just the availability of labor. So that's something we're all sort of focusing on.
Interesting. Yeah, and certainly something that's been really booming in Rochester. And, we keep tabs with the universities there too. And we love to see the growth of that. And, speaking of the growth of the industry, there's questions about federal funding and things like that, a lot of research has relied on. Has anyone from, those companies in Rochester come to you and say that they're concerned with what may be happening in the future, or, where things are kind of heading?
Yeah, I think there's real concern from all different sectors of the business community who are raising concerns. And I think if you went through and sort of tick them off, first and foremost, the impact of tariffs. And it's first, the first question is, whether the tariffs are the appropriate tool to grow an economy. They've never been used as broadly in this manner as the president is currently using them. And when they have been used, even in similar ways, you think about the Depression with Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which people will probably remember more from Ferris Bueller's Day Off than they will from their history books, but was not a success. It actually deepened and lengthened the Great Depression. So I think they're concerned about that. The second thing they're concerned about, and this, anyone who's been engaged with business leaders, thought about this, knows that perhaps the worst thing and the biggest challenge is unpredictability. So yeah, we can all talk about level of taxation. We can all talk about workers' compensation rates. We can talk about liability issues. You can talk about all manner of things, but not knowing what any particular day or month is going to bring makes it impossible, I think, for people who are trying to think about, where will I site my next plant? Where will I invest my resources? Where do I deploy people? If you're a very small company, it's probably less of an impact in terms of where you're going to build, and it certainly is for larger companies. But then it's also the cost of goods. It's hard to imagine. And I think, Joe, you know this, when you're dealing with really sophisticated pieces of equipment, sophisticated machines, sophisticated processes, it's not likely that everything in the supply chain that it takes to build that is in your community. And it's also unlikely it's built entirely within the United States. So, we have partners. And I think what the tariffs also do is make it so difficult to figure out, how do I get supplies? How do I get component parts? How do I do this? And so that's really been the complaint that has been raised, certainly about the tariff policy and the economic policy. I think beyond that, there's real concern about the impact that the changes to the National Institutes of Health, to the National Science Foundation, to our investments in all manner of things that involve science and research. And we wouldn't have optics. We wouldn't have chips. We wouldn't have all the things that we now come to rely on as Americans and our sort of way of life without optics, without chips. Those are essential parts. You couldn't even use your cell phone without it. So, and the science that went into it, I remember as a kid, you're younger than me, so you didn't live through this, but, Americans complaining about the investment that we made as a nation in the space program. And, if you look back in the late 50s, the United States probably invested 0.6% in as related to GDP in research and development. In the 60s, during the space race, it rose to nearly 2% of GDP. We're back down to 6.7%. I really had hoped that the CHIPS and Science Act, regional technology hubs would elevate that, and we were starting to see, I think, some real growth there. I'm afraid that we are really hurting our investments in both basic science and applied science. And then the third thing is the sort of cutbacks in help for university students, for K through 12. You're not going to have really smart people available to you if you're not going to invest in sciences and you're not going to invest in education. I don't know how we compete with the Chinese on quantum sciences or AI or the further development of chips and optical systems if we're not going to invest in people. So sorry again for the long answer, but there's a lot that people are really, really concerned about, and I think they have every right to be.
Yeah, and we talked about the kind of resources that are also something that could be impacted. China has export controls on some rare earths that are very important to the semiconductor industry, but the people element too. Talking about current policies and some things that are kind of is there a risk or a concern? And I know there's a lot of great schools in Rochester for optics. Is there a risk or a concern that we may lose students, promising students who could grow in the photonics industry who just say, these American universities are not helping me the way I would have expected?
Yeah, I think, and particularly when you're in a place, as we are in so many different industries with shortage of workers. So you'd think, okay, shortage of workers, we need to do a couple different things. And the birth rate in the United States is probably about 1.6 per woman, and it needs to be about 2.1 just to maintain population. So we're losing population. Now the Chinese are and others are as well. But, if you can't find workers for your industries, you'd think you'd do two things. You'd look to people who haven't participated in these fields before and say, well, let's try to reach out to them. Let's try to engage people who maybe haven't had opportunities. So if that means Black and brown people, if it means women, we had a great emphasis on STEM for women. Now we're discouraging all of that because we don't believe in diversity or equity and inclusion in the federal government, or at least in the administration. So that's one way that we could have increased the supply of workers. The second would be through a rational immigration policy, and I don't see that coming out of this administration. So I think those are real concerns, and layer on to it what you just said, which is if you're going to struggle because you can't get Pell Grants or you can't go to school, or alternatively, researchers who might have been at your university that you could have worked with and trained under are now thinking about going to Germany or going to Great Britain or going to other European countries where they're investing more and they're certainly more welcoming. And so, researchers want to do they want to make money? Of course. Do they want to make sure their families are fed? But they're driven by science, by discovery, by innovation, by being a part of something that's never happened before. That's what really drives researchers, at least the ones I talk to. Sure, you feel the same way. So if they're not valued and they feel as though they're being targeted now, why would they stay here? They'll go explore their science somewhere else and their research somewhere else. That also hurts the students who would have trained under them. So I hate to be so negative about it, but you just see so many things and you scratch your head and say, why are we doing that? How does that advance our national interests? What are our national interests? Where's that great call that parallels John Kennedy's call in 1962 to go to the moon before the end of the decade and invest people? And I mentioned the space program was one when I was young. People would complain about investments in the space program. Why are we investing money in manned space? We're doing it again, thankfully, most of it by private companies. But think of all the things, the advances in technology that came about that investment, right? So in material science, in weather forecasting, in satellites, in communication, all those things were the outcrop of the investment we made in the space program and in the science that surrounded it. So, these are really the things that we ought to be doing in investing, in my view.
Mm. And some of the policies coming out now, that it seems there's a direction of trying to bring manufacturing home, to gather resources from home, and maybe we've become too reliant on China in these ways. Is there some merit to the idea that we should be maybe mining for more resources at home, or trying to take some things that are produced overseas and make them here in America.
Yeah, I think there's no question. So I completely agree with that, which is why I had the privilege debating the major procedural question on the Chips and Science Act on the House floor, and said, look, this is what we ought to be doing. Maybe some of it is, I guess, is the stick. That's what President Trump seems to feel. But much more of this, I think, is the carrot. Investing in these critical industries, that's what Chips and Science Act was about, the Regional Tech Hub, which I mentioned. So absolutely. And I also think, Joe, it doesn't necessarily have to be exclusively America. I think it could be shared by our allies and partners. For instance, Canada, which has been a longtime ally. We occupy the border between Canada and the United States is the longest unguarded border in the world between two nations. They've been friends. Many people from Canada vacation during the summers in the Finger Lakes in my area where we have close proximity. And this, by the same token, many New Yorkers and people around the Great Lakes like to visit Canada, Ontario, Niagara Falls, Niagara-on-the-Lake. There's great places during the summertime. That's really come to I don't want to say it's a screeching halt, but it has slowed down dramatically. And Canada's a great partner. I don't know why we're picking fights with Canada. I don't know why we're picking fights with other European allies. I was in Japan and Korea about a month ago, not defending the United States policies because I don't know that these tariffs are defensible, but certainly engaging in a conversation where their attitude was a little bit like, why are you doing that? We thought we were friends. We thought we were allies. And we now feel that there's hostility toward us. So, look, we absolutely want to be bringing more jobs back to the United States. We want to build things in the United States. It's good for us economically. It's good from a national security point of view. But we have to be thoughtful and reasonable how to do this. And simply raising tariffs and taxing American citizens as a way to do it is not the right, in my view, not the way to do it. And look, you know this. You can't build, even if you were a company and said, okay, look, we're not going to buy goods from overseas, and it's not just China. We're not going to buy goods from other countries that have, the tariffs are now being set up. But you can't set up a factory line in a couple of weeks or months. I mean, it takes years. Even if you've already sited the facility, you got to build it out. You got to bring in machinery, and you got to set up manufacturing lines, and you got to hire and train people. It does take some time to do, which is why I thought the Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act as it related to clean energy, those were more investments, and I think are more the right thing to do, certainly, than I think broad-based tariffs are.
And talking about the CHIPS Act, these things came about when we realized, when we had the pandemic, we had the screeching halt. Whoa, we do not have the semiconductors at home, and this is really going to be an issue if we don't correct this. And that was something that seemed to garner some bipartisan support of both, sides of the aisle saying, yeah, this is something we need to work on. And then we have the Optics and Photonics Caucus that comes up as, kind of a joint group to get both sides to talk on this. I wanted to talk about the status of, these bipartisan movements, the CHIPS Act and the Optics and Photonics Caucus, and see where they stand today, and see, and ask why it's so important at a time where there is so much kind of fighting back and forth, why it's so important to have this showing of bipartisan support.
Well, you raise a really good point, and a broader point is that bipartisanship seems to have largely gone away in Washington, and I think that's incredibly unfortunate. I think the best ideas are those when you can get together with people who disagree with you, find common ground or find creative ways to move forward, and that's what should happen. And frankly, not to really bore your listeners and your viewers, but we have the difference between the number of Democrats and Republicans, for instance, in the House of Representatives, is a handful. So you'd think, well, if there's such narrow majorities, isn't there a place for bipartisan? Shouldn't people come together and try to figure out broadly how we gain acceptance? And I think we would really like to do that. I know that I would like to do it. Most of my career has been spent in split government. I was in the state legislature for many years, and we had Republican Senate and a Democratic state assembly. Then of the 300 bills that I was honored to author and sign into law, every single one of them had a Republican sponsor in the Senate. So I think that is the way to do it. And that honestly, it stops you from doing extreme things on either side, because the, sort of the compromise will weed that out. But that has not been welcome, sadly, by the Republicans in the House of Representatives. I think it's still a little more the case in the United States Senate, which I'm grateful for. So I think that's unfortunate. But we are still continuing to work on trying to drive bipartisanship and make it work. The caucus that you talk about, the Optics and Photonics Caucus, which I have the privilege of being one of the co-chairs of, is a bipartisan caucus. So it's Brian Mast from Florida and myself in the House, and Senators Daines and from Montana, and of course Mark Kelly, the former astronaut who represents Arizona. So we're the four leads of the caucus. Has a number of members, and we try to make sure that we're bipartisan in what we do. So when we're interfacing with the photonics industry, with the optics community, that we're speaking, we may not have one voice, but we're all committed to advancing the industry and making sure that there's public policy that's respectful of the industry and doing the kinds of things that would help grow the industry. So that's really important. And I think the CHIPS and Science Act was bipartisan, and the president has continued to say he wants to eliminate the program. I think that would be a huge mistake. I saw Speaker Johnson said he would support repeal of it. Again, I think that's just, it goes back to my first comments about predictability. If you're a chip manufacturer and you're kind of relying on this, and you've started down the road towards making an investment in the United States, I have up in central New York, just a little to the east of me, Micron is building a chip fab. It's enormous. It's going to mean tens of thousands of permanent jobs. It's critical for the industry. It helps continue to build the semiconductor corridor from Intel in Ohio all the way through east into New York. If we take away those programs, I dare say those investments may go away, and I think that would be tragic.
And back on the caucus, how active is that today? Going onto the website to check the updates, don't see a whole lot of new news going on there. Granted, a lot is happening, I understand, but how active is the caucus today?
It's generally reasonably active. I mean, it's more active than most caucuses. A lot of them are, like the beer caucus, and nothing wrong with beer, trust me. But I think we're more active. We try to really use the caucus to highlight, when the industry's doing something that's important, try to highlight the caucus, try to use it as an opportunity to bring staff around, because sometimes while members of the legislature have many, many demands on their time, making sure you're communicating with staff members, because they help drive in a large way what the priorities are in the various offices, making them aware. And that's really part of this, is just to have people understand the importance of the industry in its current state, but also the potential for this industry in the future. And look, with advances in artificial intelligence and quantum computing and quantum communications, you're going to have the greater demand for photonics, greater demand for optical devices. So it's just really about educating members and staff on the importance of the sector, and the importance of the sector from a competitive perspective for the United States going forward.
And naturally, when administrations change, agendas change, what kind of influence have you seen on what the Optics and Photonics Caucus has been trying to achieve, trying to do since the shift in administrations?
Well, I think they're trying to understand, I think as we all are, what's happening. I mean, the signature legislative agenda item of the president is the tax bill and the so-called reconciliation budget that we're working on right now. And then we go through what, is an appropriations process where we'll sort of figure out this year's budget. I think people are really paying attention to those things, and to the extent that they are finished, that I think will give enormous cues to people as to what to expect. Right now it's hard. I think people are just struggling to understand, where do they fit in? What's this going to be? What is this going to settle down? What's the new normal? And I think that sort of the president's approach has been to try to inject in as much chaos. And I think that's by design, but at some point it's got to settle down. You got to know what you're working in, what's the environment that I'm in, what are the rules, whether it's tax policy or investment policy. There's a number of things in the tax bill that I've authored that look like they're going to be included, which will increase investment for businesses that I'm very proud of. But I think people are just a little bit in a wait and see attitude.
And getting back onto tariffs, which is such a dominating headline right now, China and the U.S. they've agreed to this 90-day pause for a lot of what's been going on, but that doesn't mean they're gone forever, right? It's a pause, so they could be coming back. We don't really know. We're in this uncertain age. Do we know long term what the enforcement of these tariffs could mean for the photonics and optics industries?
Well, it's a great question, and I think, to your point, sort of the financial markets have responded positively to the pause. But as you say, it's a 90-day pause, and there's nothing that prevents the president or China from breaking the sort of agreement that they have for 90 days. I mean, if you think about it, President Trump is the one, his administration signed the USMCA, which was the deal between Mexico and Canada. In his first days in his second term, he broke all the rules of the USMCA. So I think 90 days gives you a chance to catch your breath, perhaps. But if you're a business person and you're trying to make investments, or you may get a temporary relief when it comes to ordering supplies or component parts from places. But are you making big investments without knowing what happens at the end of 90 days? What if this falls apart and we go back to where we were? Or alternatively, the tariffs go down? So I think it's really, I just talked to a business leader last week who needs aluminum that he sources in Canada. That's where his source has been. And he said the price has fluctuated dramatically, and he's not really sure what to do right now because he doesn't know what the price will be in another couple of weeks. So I think that's going to continue to be a big issue. Maybe less so for optics companies, but I doubt it. I just think anybody who has supplies and needs supplies is, sort of in a position where they don't know what to do. And frankly, if your sole supplier is in China, that just drove up your price because you don't have an alternative place to go. And again, long term, it'd be good to obviate the need to go to China, that we need other suppliers. But some of these industries are really complex. They're very nuanced. And you just can't, it's not like, no disrespect to, shoe manufacturers, but there's a lot less technology in making a shoe or in sewing a suit than there is in building optical devices and in building quantum machines and chips. So, the level of investment you need and the level of capitalization is so great that if you don't have any answers, it's really hard to make decisions.
Mm-hmm. And we know certainly in your district, and we talked a little bit about the history of the photonics industry there, but definitely nationally too. How is the message, and I'm talking more in like the last 5 years, how's the message been to growing and nurturing a photonics workforce to advance these technologies in these industries?
I worked a great deal with folks in the defense space around the workforce. And the National Manufacturing Institute that helped AIM Photonics in New York was designated as one. And a lot of that had to do with training the workforce, making sure that not only are we attracting new people to the industry, but also making sure that the incumbent workforce has upgraded the skills that they need to continue to be able to compete. So, nothing is static in this world. Things are going to change all the time. There's new innovations, new invention, new materials. And if you're in that space, if you work in that space currently, you got to you really got to keep up to date on all of those changes if you're going to continue to be marketable in the industry and you're going to be able to compete in the industry. So there was a lot of attention given to it for actually a number of years, even through the first Trump administration. I'm really concerned now, though, that there won't be that emphasis any longer, that it's, and I understand the impulse to say, let's get the government out of everything. Just let the private sector do it. But I don't even know that the private sector feels that they're the best at training workers that they're the best at some of the softer skills. And I don't think that they mind having public-private partnerships around this and to lean into community colleges and lean into other educational institutions, because I think it lowers their costs. It helps them get more workers into the pipeline. So I think it's something we'll see what the impact is, but I feel like we're just headed in the wrong direction. I hope I'm wrong, and I'm certainly not betting against America and want America to be successful. I just have grave concerns about where we are.
Mhm. And looking outside of America, the global photonic market from independent analysts is estimated to be valued at about 1.75 trillion this year, and it's expected to go to about 2.4 trillion by 2030. I mean, is this enough to emphasize the importance of the U.S. working to continue to be an industry leader, to try and stay an industry leader in these sectors?
Boy, I certainly hope so. It needs to be, and I have two subcommittees that I serve on the House Appropriations Committee. The first helps fund the Commerce Department, the Justice Department, all the science programs. So making decisions about where we invest in the National Science Foundation or NASA or NIST. The other subcommittee I serve on is the Defense Subcommittee. And you can certainly imagine, and everyone else can imagine, how much technology has always played a role in warfare, but how much it's played a role now, whether it's, unmanned drones or sensors, or now taking the fighting domain into space with Space Force and things that we're doing in terms of satellite technology, hypersonic vehicles. I mean, the list goes on and on of the things, and you're not going to be able to build any of that without real investment in photonics, photonic chips, optics. I mean, you can't do any of these things without it. So I would hope that policymakers within the federal government and within the White House and in the Commerce Department will appreciate the potential market here for Americans, but also how strategically important this industry is.
We talked a lot too about China's overall impact on the industry, and they do control the supply chain in a lot of regards, producing 70% of some specific rare earths that are so crucial in this technology. Do you think that America is doing enough to cut back on this reliance on China for this tech, and to kind of get these materials from home or other means, or to produce products domestically?
It's a really great question. They've certainly done an amazing job, not only in China, but they, in the Congo, they now got mines around the world so they've really worked hard at trying to control the rare earth metals. They're the primary producers of gallium and germanium, both of which are critical to optics. They have huge impact on lithium and things that go into electric batteries as we try to transition away from fossil fuels. So we're going to have to think of new technologies. We had, a company in Rochester which is struggling, but was able to sort out of old batteries, lithium and cobalt and nickel, so we can recycle them and reuse them. But this is a significant challenge. And again, I'm hoping, rather than just saying, well, let the markets do whatever they want, that we need a strategy and a policy about it so that we can lessen the reliance that we have on China right now, because those are pinch points strategically that they know they have, and I'm sure they're going to continue to lean into them. We're going to have to think through how we address this, and the impact of the tariffs on that is significant.
What are your hopes for the United States long term, and the role it'll play in the optics and photonics industries?
Well, look, I think we're not going to be successful if we don't continue to compete and be at the cutting edge and leading the world in AI development, in the quantum sciences. And you can't do that if you're not going to invest in them. I mean, one of the complaints that our leaders have about China is, that they want to do this in the free market. But in China, there is no free market. I mean, they can employ public dollars and are. So you can't entirely compete if you're not going to, we're not going to be a government like China. We're not going to eliminate freedoms of people and liberties of people, but we ought to at least think about whether or not we're prepared to make the kind of investments that they're making in these places. Because if they, quote unquote, win, whatever winning means in AI or the quantum spaces, they're going to have enormous competitive advantages over us, national security wise, economically. So we have to really think about it, and you just can't be sort of laissez-faire. I'm going to just, let whatever happens, let them, just be kind of let the markets do what they do. The markets aren't going to maximize, because it's not what they do. It's not a criticism of the markets. They don't make investments. They're looking for the next quarter. They're looking for day to day what they need to do to be able to dry up share prices. And so the longer term investments, that's the role of the government, and working together with our business partners and business leaders around those investments, which is why the federal government does a fair amount of basic research, because it's not economically feasible for companies to do it. It is feasible for them to take the basic research and to do applied research and come up with products and commercialization. That is what they do. And yeah, they do a fair amount of research on their own as well. But there has to be a national strategy about this, or else I fear we'll fall further and further behind.
Congressman Morelle, thank you so much again for giving us the time and answering these questions for us. We really appreciate your insight.
Well, thanks to you. This is such an important subject. And, you'd like to think that the industry didn't have to worry about what the government's doing, but we're all together in this fight, and we have to really think about it. So appreciate all the work you do, and appreciate, how much you help people in the sector understand what's going on in the world.
We reached out to Republican Congressman and Optics and Photonics Caucus co-chair Brian Mast, who represents Florida's 21st District. Mast and his team did not follow up with photonic spectra for this podcast.